Hi, I'm Mina Malik Hussain and you are watching The Coffee Table, and today I'm so excited because today is my favorite kind of show. We're going to be talking about books today, and who better to talk about books with than my two wonderful guests, one of whom is the author of this wonderful debut collection of short stories called Are You Enjoying? And I think that when you see the cover, it's instantly recognizable, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with Miss Meera Sethi today on the show. Meera is an actor and a writer who you most recently will have seen on screen in the smash hit drama Chupke Chupke. She's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, and is the author of Are You Enjoying? Her debut collection of stories, which came out with Knopf earlier this year. No?
Yeah, and Bloomsbury in England.
And Bloomsbury in England. And speaking of Bloomsbury in England, our second guest is Faiza Sultan Khan, who is a former consulting publisher at Bloomsbury Publishing. She now is a freelance literary consultant and is the co-host of the fantastic literature podcast Browned Off, which she hosts with the other excellent author, Moni Mohsin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I love talking about books. I go into a special zone and I'm like, yes, like Smeagol, na?
I know, and the colors are also so you, na?
It's true. I feel like, maybe I should have had a different ensemble today, more neon. But Meera, tell me, how does it feel? Your baby is out in the world.
It feels amazing. I've been on a tour for the last 2-3 months. So in the US, virtual tour. So yeah, it's felt really nice to talk about the book. You plug away at it on your own, and then finally it's out in the world. And it's very interesting the way people are reacting to it in ways that are surprising and delightful, and sometimes also, some that really make me sit back and think, I wasn't going for this, but it's amazing that you think this about the work.
Yeah.
Once it's out, it has a life of its own.
It really does. And I feel like that's probably alternatively exciting and terrifying, because there's always I don't want to say risk, but there's always the likelihood that people will receive it in unique ways. And as an author, do you feel like, is it sort of nerve-wracking to make sure that you get the message across,
Yeah, I mean, that's what's really tricky, right? Because as a writer of fiction, the message has to be so subliminal. It has to be really kind of understated. Otherwise, write an article in a newspaper, write a pamphlet.
Yeah.
So, wo messaging wali jo baat hai, I think, yeah. So, one of the things that's been really interesting is that people have felt that my endings are kind of, they're not as strong or as messagey as people would have liked, but it's fiction again. Like if I hammer you on the head with the point of the text, then what's the point? And Faiza, my editor, my brilliant editor, Faiza actually edited this book. One of the things that she really encouraged, and one of the things that I loved about her, sort of the apprenticeship that I had with her in the editing process, was that she encouraged me to not explain anything. This like, for example, gulab jamun, a comma, deep fried dessert, or like a deep fried milk curd. She encouraged me not to do things like that, which is I'm very grateful for, and I think that's how fiction should be written.
No, absolutely. And this is something that I want to cycle back to, is this sort of, what do you have to keep in mind when you are coming from a particular milieu? And I feel like when one is writing as a South Asian, there are so many things that one is tempted to describe. But then there's an incredible amount of self-consciousness, I think, about certain things. And we will come back to that in a minute, because I have many opinions about this. I'm just like, a mango, should it rain? I don't know.
I know. Monsoon, can you even mention the word monsoon? Chutneys is, I think, very now done.
The chutney era is over. But hi, Faiza, can you hear me?
I certainly can.
Excellent. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I'm glad that Meera brought up this sort of idea of explaining and the idea of the moral of the story. And do you feel that readers still all want to be told what happened in this, in any text? Do you feel like that's still this kind of instinct for spoon feeding that readers haven't really grown out of?
I hope that we're at some sort of turning point at the moment, because there's a lot of talk of diversity in England right now. And I hope that means that readers will get to write stories which are just the stories that they want to tell, without worrying about lugging about the burden of representation, as we always have done from, as non-white writers, from countries where it's almost as if, is there any point in you having written this story if you have not, come like an explorer to kind of explain your culture? Are you a writer, or are you an ambassador for your country and for your society? So that's the thing which I'm very much hoping we will be able to move past. And that is an area in which I thought this book was so exciting. It feels fresh and contemporary. It feels like it's being written to discuss essentially universal experiences, and not experiences that you'd only have if you are Pakistani. And then it also doesn't do that thing which a separate issue which I'd like to move on to at some point is the disaster, which is the fact that so much of South Asia has internalized this narrative, basically, which I think is worse, frankly, than kind of Western expectations. But what it doesn't do, Are You Enjoying, which I love so much about it, is that it doesn't set up its world as a series of contradictions. It's not sort of, well, this is what you think Pakistan is, but this is the quote-unquote real Pakistan, which is an attitude taken by rather too many books for reasons that are not entirely their fault.
Yes. I like how Mira's been sort of nodding furiously throughout this bit. No, but it is true. And this whole idea of contradictions, and I think that a lot of times, and again, I have been, because I write and I read, and I do sort of overhear, like on social media, I'm sort of actively eavesdropping on how readers are responding to different books, because it does inform the way one approaches their own work as well, I think. And this idea that who is the real representation? Like, what is the real representation? What is the real Pakistan? And I feel like it's also so limiting, because everybody's experience is
universal and valid.
And valid, absolutely. So there's sort of this idea also that, and I think maybe, Faiza, is this the narrative that you meant? This sort of idea that when we are writing, and again, South Asian, I'm sort of broadening the scope of this, is that, we expect a certain kind of story where there must be suffering and there must be violence and somewhere a bomb will go off and, everything will be dusty and
I think there
inexplicable.
I think there is an expectation, certainly if you get published in the West, to explain, as Faiza said and I said earlier, to explain your part of the world, right? And to break it down for them, to make it digestible, to explain it in a very sort of just in a very accessible fashion, and to use the tropes that they are familiar with, and the tropes that the West finds both soothing and explanatory, but also contradictory enough for it to be interesting. But I really wanted to write about Pakistan with a lowercase p, not the Pakistan that you read about in newspapers, because we read about that anyway. We get those stories anyway. In the New York Times or in the Guardian or even here, you will read about the bombings that are going off, and that's not to say that one shouldn't write about them, but what are the stories that you don't hear, right? How are people living and loving in Pakistan? How are secret lives being lived out in Pakistan? In the absence of institutions not working, how are people creating networks of solidarity to get by? How are identity politics playing out in Pakistan? What are the little ecosystems of resilience that people like you and me and the folks who are recording this program, right? How do we get by? Well, those stories, right? And what are the stories of ambition and aspiration and love and lust? So I really was, and as an actor, I'm privy to a lot of this playing out in Karachi. You came to one of my sets for one of your projects, and you saw that happening. And so that is really, bubbling, fresh, real life being lived out and played out. And that to me is fascinating.
No, absolutely. And I also feel like this is where this idea also comes in that, and maybe Faiza, you can also weigh in on this, is that when we are talking about it, I think this often happens to to female writers and women's writing, and the category itself is kind of annoying to me because it's just writing. Like, why do we have a separate sort of space for lady writers to stand in a ladies? This is the ladies writing section, But this idea of the grand narrative and how sort of it's literature with a capital L when it's a grand narrative across eons and across time, and it's sort of events are unfolding on this epic scale, and it's a very sort of masculine approach to writing. And one thing that I really enjoyed with Are You Enjoying? I do my little jokes to myself is that, and this is what I feel is something that women do really well, is to write the particular and to kind of bring that focus down into, like you said, these ecosystems of resilience, which are literally just, a young couple in their apartment.
Sure.
Or, somebody who's sort of navigating these feudal in-laws in their haveli, at the farm, at the village, not the farm.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think, going back to what both you and Faiza have been saying, is that the street aspect, the local flavor is so important, right? I do think that a question that a non-Western writer has to ask themselves early on in their career is, above all, do I want to be a bridge to the West? Above all, do I want to write explanatory literature? And the answer is, not really, right? Like, I've been published in the West, and so you do want to bring the news that is not being talked about to them, and not just the West, but to the world, but not necessarily in the ways that they're used to. Again, those big picture masculine ways that they're used to talking about, whether it's, after 9/11, I think there was a cottage industry of writing that was explaining Islam in the West to Islam and terrorism to the West, right? And so just get beyond that. Like, that, it's fine to write about that too, but what are the stories that are not being told? And, I also have to say, like, I didn't go into this with an agenda thinking, like, I will tell the story that is emphatically not being told. I just wrote about the stuff that interests me. That's actually the honest truth. and no, but that's so, like, it sounds so obvious, but I don't think it is that obvious. Correct.
And Faiza, do you feel, and again, I wonder how you've been in this unique position where you have been as a woman of color, and you've been at a very big imprint as that Bloomsbury is. And do you feel that the text that you were getting, or the manuscripts that you were getting, do you feel like there was this kind of self-consciousness there when it was coming from writers of color or South Asian writers, where it was this sense of, this bridging sense that Mira mentioned?
I mean, I think that it has been so deeply internalized that people don't necessarily see that they're doing it any longer to a great extent. And also, as Mira was saying, I think it's even less a manner of wanting to tell stories that you feel haven't been told, because, again, that too becomes representative. It's just a thing of, I want to tell a story. Yeah. I'm just going to tell a story. Everyone else has the right to write about what they feel like writing about. Yes. And why must I either present, if I want to write about terrorism, I'm going to do, if I want to write about the refugee crisis, I'm going to write an excellent book about it. Or if I want to write about, sort of desire or just, the quiet, I love quiet little books, the quiet internality of a relationship, for example. I can do that as well. But I think there are a couple of things that happen over here, which is that, okay, so I think that you see the books that do well. Those are the books that people hear about. And those come to represent, as you said, literature with a capital L. And if people don't see role models or examples of other things, they do themselves start to believe that this is literally what writing is.
Correct.
So, for example, should you be in the position of being, say, a social satirist from Pakistan, you'll have people who themselves will experience this, I don't know if it's like cognitive dissonance, who are like, my God, that was so funny, that was so clever, but
it was about you.
This is, but like, this is not a proper book. Write a proper book, because a proper book has to, even to other Pakistanis represent, like, where is the poverty? Where is the strife? Oh my God, there are characters in this book who are privileged. What the hell is that all about?
How dare you?
I just find that, absolutely. And also the funniest thing is that you're told, oh my God, there are characters who are privileged in this book, and you are told this in people's drawing rooms, with sort of coffee tables among sheafs of kind of lalique figurines and things. And there's sort of, they literally, there is this strange thing that they don't seem to be able to make the connection that, actually your life is also a story. And, just because you haven't sort of experienced what you recognize as trauma, it's still valid.
Yeah.
So
Faiza, I'm so glad that you've called it the proper book. And of course, my personal favorite example of dissonance is when people on social media are squabbling about elite privilege, where one is like, you're in a developing country fighting in English over the internet, probably on a personal handheld device that costs a lot of money. So, but of course you're not privileged. It's not you. Not you at all. Like it.
Look, you should be, anyone, anywhere should basically be able to write about everything, provided you are not causing people pain.
Yeah.
Right? I think that is the, rich people are complicated and messed up and have problems just like everybody else. And so write about them if that's interesting to you.
Yeah. Absolutely. No.
Yeah.
And I think that this is also where, like, Faiza, you said, not the proper novel. So is there a kind of formula to it, or is there an invisible line that a book has to cross to go from a novel to, again, a proper novel?
I mean, I fear in the West, it's still that it's expected to kind of virtually teach you something. I mean, this is obviously not the case. And there are, some magnificently subtle and brilliant writers who've experienced great success, which, is a delight. But I feel that in order to kind of make everyone understand that this is something worth reading, just to perhaps say that this is exceptionally well written is not quite enough. It has to be a part of, where does this slot into the kind of greater cultural narrative? And especially when it's to do with race, if you're gonna be difficult and be non-white, then you better have the decency to at least tell people what it's like, seems to be the overarching belief.
We're going to take a very quick break at this juncture. Stay with us and we'll be back with this fascinating conversation in just 1 minute. Welcome back to the show, where we are in conversation with actor and writer Meera Sethi and former consulting publisher at Bloomsbury Publishing and now freelance literary consultant Faiza Sultan Khan. Now, before the break, Faiza, we were talking about, what constitutes a proper novel and how a lot of times there's certain genres of writing like satire or romance or mysteries, which aren't seen as sort of serious writing, and it's seen as sort of, it's entertaining. But I know that, and I think you and I both agree here, that a lot of women's writing is done in those genres. And do you think that's why it generally doesn't tend to be taken that seriously, or is it just a genre thing?
I have a potentially crazy theory, which I shall air here with you,
Very good.
which is that it is something in the entire enterprise of reading where, which is where the problem lies. Those of us who read, and publishing as an industry has somewhere decided to believe its own hype and to buy into the myth, I think a very bourgeois myth, that reading makes people better and that reading is improving. Reading must be improving. You are reading it to either learn something, to become a more empathetic human being, to become a better person. And as such, for something to be entertaining, for it to simply be incredibly well rendered, is then, perceived as not enough. But also my bigger gripe is that a lot of women's writing, and a lot of writing in general, genre writing, which is considered entertaining, if you are a halfway perceptive reader, you will see that it's actually not possible to write anything well without reflecting kind of social, sexual, political mores.
Yes.
And so if the reader is so dim that they need to sort of be told, that here, this is a very important issue, here, let me signpost it for you.
Yes.
And unfortunately, these seem to be the people who decide whether books are good or not. So I think it's kind of two separate things altogether. I mean, there is the issue of women's quote unquote issues, which just happen to be, all of life. But sort of, this notion that, a relationship is not as important as men going off to war, which is, patently ridiculous, largely because of the best novels about war are also written about people's lives and the internality of their existence rather than the war itself. So it's like, it's a bunch of things.
Now, again, sort of coming back to the book. And I love the title because I did enjoy it very much.
Thank you.
And there's also, again, do you feel like that is also something that is particularly pervasive in sort of brown, at least let's say South Asian readers? Again, the sense that, when you read the book, then you should be left with, an idea about things. Or again, like the moral. And do you think that's why it's been unsettling for readers to not have an ending that is very pat and very
closure?
Closure, exactly. And it's funny because you can't have that in real life.
Of course.
Somehow we want it.
That's very interesting. I think in South Asia, actually, I think a lot of my folks who've read this in India and Pakistan have understood the humor in it, right? They've understood that. I mean, there are a lot of Urdu words in this as well. And I think that some of them have just understood the sensibility, and that's been enough. But for a lot of, I don't necessarily want to say white readers, but maybe people not from South Asia, they've wanted more context. And, it's not, the onus should not be on the author to explain things, as I said. But just going back to what Faiza was saying earlier about a book always having something like a social message, even if you're not hammering someone on the head with it. I think that's absolutely right. Mina, it's been fascinating. On my book tour, I've been in conversation with other writers, and everybody who's spoken to me, each person has come to this book with their own theory about what the book is about. So early on, I had some conversation partners who said, this is really about strong women, your book. And I said, yes, it is. And I didn't set out to write about strong women. I suppose I'm surrounded by strong women, strong matriarchs, and so they made their way into the book. Then I was talking to someone who said, I think your book is about power. And I thought to myself, you know what? It is. There are a lot of men and women negotiating power dynamics, and generationally also, younger generation versus the older generation, the old order falling away, the younger generation trying to make its place. And so it's been fascinating to me as a writer to realize that, so much of writing is a kind of slow dredging up of my own subconscious. And that's one of the things I love about fiction, is that it's like therapy. I write, and then 2 years later, I'm like, oh, I was really interested in female desire. How fascinating, And so, basically you create all these problems, and then you have to solve them yourself. So you set about creating problems to which you don't have answers, but you have to sort of, just figure it out while you're doing it.
I think that's a wonderful way to put it. But at this juncture, also, I think it's important to, and again, this is for you, audience, is that it's a piece of writing is coming from the writer's psyche, of course, but that doesn't mean that it's about them necessarily. And I think a lot of audiences really love this idea that I will know everything about this author because, this lady in the story likes to, eat pickles. So Mira must like pickle.
And also Breezy Blessings, which is about an actress. A lot of people have asked me, did that happen to you? And, other things have happened to me. And she's not me at all, right? No. But the power dynamic on the set, yes, that's coming from my own lived experience. What happens when a makeup artist is hovering around you with his brush, or the chai wala with whom, Mehek, she befriends the chai wala on set, and they have a kind of camaraderie, and they're each other's. So that stuff is stuff I see and I observe. But yes, it's very funny when people ask me, "Ki ye aapki life mein se?"
Which is nice.
Yeah, it's cute.
But I think a lot of aspiring writers who are watching this show might also be thinking about sort of what are the concerns that, and again we talked about this previously, but let's say the monsoon or about mangoes and about again this internalized narrative. But do you think that there's also this struggle here between wanting to write the story you want to tell and illustrating it and peopling it with people and incidences and weathers and foods that we all know, right? And that are home and that are familiar, but have also now fallen into that well of cliche.
I know. I thought, Mina, I challenged myself to write this book without mentioning the fruit. Without mentioning mangoes.
That must not be named.
The fruit that must not be named, exactly. And then, in A Life of Its Own, which is about a strong matriarch and her son and her daughter-in-law, I wanted to describe how the car was hurtling past the countryside and there were mango trees, God forbid.
There was an orchard.
There was an orchard. And I thought to myself, I really would love to describe it. And I did. And I thought, oh my God, I've put in, there's a mango in my book. What am I doing? But I let it be because it was natural. And I thought to myself, it's okay. I mustn't police myself in this way.
But Faisal, do you feel like as an editor, where do you stand on this? Because there is that sort of desire to make it authentic, but then also not explain yourself, but then also have a nervousness about not wanting your reader to not understand the nuance of what you're trying to say, but then also maybe it's a kind of like an exclusive experience also. And I've just thrown many things at you, but I want to add one more thing, and that is in that exclusive experience or the intimacy between the author and the reader. For example, like 99 Nights in Logar, which is Jamil Jan Kochai's wonderful book. There's a whole story in it which is just in Pashto, and if you don't know it, then out you go. And I thought there was a dual sense of longing to know, but then also I was like, I appreciate that. I don't mind being excluded from this private conversation.
No, completely. And I think Jamil Jan Kochai's book is the best book I've read about Afghanistan ever, the best novel I've read about Afghanistan ever in my life by a mile. It was amazing to me that someone could, because one has read quite sort of trope-ridden books from that part of the world, it was sort of almost amazing to me that here was someone who was telling a completely fresh version of this story of this place.
Yes.
And I loved that he did the last chapter, the last couple of pages, which are in Pashto, which I thought was wonderful. I thought, well, if you want to read it, you can go and make the effort and read it. Actually, you can figure it out. And otherwise, it's like the most sort of delicious in-joke, which you have a lot of warning that this is coming. So I thought that was completely fantastic. So to take the many, many things you threw at me, Mina, of which I must juggle. I remember, I sort of remember one or two of them. So let's go with that. But to start with authenticity, which is just to say a word I have such trouble with, and I don't know what it means. And I sort of almost feel that authentic is what you think things are when you just don't know them well enough. Like authentic is a kind of notion, like a front-facing notion of a thing, be it authentic, cuisine or how we live or whatever. Because authentic, and always like the non-white world is represented using this term. And what we need to replace that with is dynamic, because we're constantly changing and constantly evolving. And, we're not sort of like either, not just either a Western audience, or including our own diaspora's notion of us, where something is constantly progressing and changing. So for me, all I try to do is intervene in places where I think the author might be kind of trying to guess what the reader is thinking and just try to keep them in their own story, essentially. And I have no objection to mangoes, returning to that. I think it's quite funny how they've become this kind of totemic object of horror. And I would say for my part, the first thing I do when I hit Pakistan is buy pomegranates, which are underrepresented in the cliche steaks, interestingly, in Pakistan.
I think that the pomegranates are the Irans and the Afghanistan stories, and we have to have the mangoes.
We have to have the mangoes.
But I feel like watermelons are very underrepresented because they're very integral to our summertime life, and floating in the canal, and everybody's sort of guessing at it, and we should have more watermelons. But in terms of language and that particular in-joke with your audience, and that "are you enjoying," I think, is like the best
colloquialism,
joke ever.
right? Yeah.
And I think it has unnerved people also, because I have had people say to me that, but isn't that wrong English?
Oh, really? That's so funny.
And I'm like, well, what is wrong?
What is wrong? And do you not live here? Certainly, if you live here, then you've heard this phrase, right?
Yeah, no, but I think, again, there's that sense of a proper thing. This is like a proper book published by a proper publishing imprint. But the English is a bit off.
That's so funny.
But it's really interesting because, again, like, if you know, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Mina, what do you think, in your opinion? Now, we've talked about 9/11, we're talking about that, I love it, cottage industry of writing. Thrashing away at your tiny typewriter. but this renewed interest in stories from this part of the world, and this sort of global attempt to understand who we are, where we come from, how we think, so on and so forth. But do you feel like there's been some kind of evolution in the expectation of what Western, or let's say non-brown audiences want to hear from us?
I think there's been a lot of, I don't want to say soul searching, but I think there's been some humility in the West in terms of, the authors that they work with. For example, in publishing houses, I think there has been some sort of, there's been a look inward about, let us also engage on their terms. And certainly with both my publishing houses, nobody ever told me what to write. And I'm grateful for that. That was my expectation going in. And I think they are, if you write a story well, even if it's about a pair of missing socks, then it is a well-written story, right? And so I don't know if there's been a big picture shift, but they are interested in hearing about female desire, for example. After the Me Too movement, I think there has been a renewed interest in how women negotiate their lives in, say, the entertainment industries throughout the world, or wherever there's power, which is everywhere. And so a lot of people have responded to my book in that way. And I think that, and I think one of the things that my book is particularly about, since we're, talking about Pakistan and themes.
And your book.
And is that, what happens when you're constantly performing a public self? I think one of the preoccupations of this book is people are constantly performing. Even the folks who aren't professional performers are kind of chameleon-like. And they've got a public face and a private face. And I think I'm interested in that because in Pakistan, you can't always be who you are up front, and so you become sneaky, and you improvise identities as you go along. And so that's a theme, and I think people have been interested in it, and so
it's like Eliot, na? You prepare a face to meet the faces you will meet. That sort of shape-shifting,
but quality. It can also be very corrosive, right? If you're constantly performing a public self for others, then who is the real you? And I think that's something that I'm really interested in as an actor, especially because I am constantly performing, and so I'm very aware of how treacherous it can be as well.
Treacherous is me with a waggish wag of the eyebrow. But this is something that I did want to ask you about. Is that how do you feel like how the acting, has it influenced your writing in ways? Does it help you see the world differently?
It has. It has. I think I'm really interested in body language, for example. There was somebody reviewed this book and said that she's really interested in how people use their hands, and they're saying something but their facial expression is something else. And I think that's very much coming from acting, which is people, again, sort of trying to explode people's presentations of themselves. I think I'm really attuned to that because I'm an actor, and that, and also power, and between men and women, how power plays out. Those are the two things that I think I've that come from my experience as an actor. Yeah.
Which is always interesting to me because it's always really fun to talk to writers who do other things as well. And I think that this idea of, the old school idea of the writers that are holed up in their study, and just sort of thrashing away at their typewriter.
That ain't me.
Yeah, no. And that's not a lot of writers either, because it's like you have to sort of get out there into the world.
Live life.
And interact with it, and then see what sort of, what you're taking back from it.
Yeah, I do think there are still writers who are big ideas writers, and they sit in their ivory towers and they churn out books, and they don't particularly go and interact with the world. But I'm not one of those. I have to have a very, I'm a huge extrovert. I have to go and live my life. And then when I'm depleted, that's when the thoughts start coming to me.
The silence finally.
Yeah, exactly.
So Faiza, tell me, what do you think about this sort of evolution of the expectation from writers of color, if there is one at all? And then also I am curious about and because you are in the industry, it's like, where are the spaces for women? Are they sort of, are we doing better at being taken more seriously, or more publishers wanting to hear more from women in ways that are not necessarily only about, the typical 5 things that women, get published writing?
So I think there's been a very interesting shift, just talking about women over here, and not women of color, which is a separate, let's just put that aside for one moment. And Mira was talking about, the different faces, the sort of one's different personas, essentially, in Pakistan, and which you took that marvelous opportunity to drop some proof-rock, Mina. It was very impressive.
Thank you for appreciating.
I wanted to,
it was for you.
Obviously, that. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. But I wanted to say that, so it's also being a person, like being non-white in this industry. You code switch all the time, right? So there's no way you can be kind of one racial identity. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
But to go back to what I've seen in women's writing and what it looks like now, is that at some point, I'm not entirely sure when it was, perhaps it was in the early 2000s. So I used to be sort of almost Generation Bridget Jones.
Yeah.
And that was really what that was the zeitgeist writing of my era, what I consider my era of my 20s.
Yeah.
And that is kind of what I grew up around, was women writing about essentially patriarchy, but just describing it in a way that was, awfully good fun, and about the internal lives of women, of which, involve the kind of networks that they've made. As Mira mentioned this earlier about Pakistan, but the networks and the resilience and, all of that you make when more formal avenues wish to exclude you, don't take you seriously.
Yeah.
So I feel, and, you'll find that those sorts of books don't really exist any longer, so sort of like the kind of gigantic sitcoms you used to have in the 90s, you no longer have the kind of billion copy selling chick lit that people of all manner of different ages, which is the zeitgeist book of the time.
Yeah.
And I think what happened in the early 2000s is that at some point it was decided that now women are going to be confessional and revelatory, and they're going to write non-fiction memoirs, which are going to be about the various things that have happened to them, which perhaps were not spoken of previously in polite society. Yes. So if this may well be, and something sort of like an early one of these, I would say was Prozac Nation. And, so take something, kind of like that. Then there have been several of them, grief, addiction, depression.
Motherhood.
These are the sort of... Yeah, motherhood, absolutely. So a lot of what I've seen, and I think it's interesting because it is still white middle-class women writing these by and large. But what I find has happened is that is where what used to be chick lit has now kind of gone, where that energy has gone and where that market has gone as well, actually. So, which I think is, it's great, it's exciting, it's wonderful to, hear more about women's lives in ways that they may not have written them or may not have written them as overtly, because of course these issues have always existed, women have always written about them, but they may have sort of written about them in a more covert manner previously. Yes. So I think that's now more out there, and of course it's delightful. My only concern is that does that mean that women's writing is now only of value if you are creating quote unquote strong women characters, and if you are in fact having to kind of slit your wrists and say this is the inner me, watch me sort of either suffer or this or just at a very basic level, that because this is a real thing that happened to me, you are obliged to find it interesting and edifying, because sometimes it's actually just not, and that's also all right. So.
And again, do you think that in an odd way it's a return to that grand narrative, that masculine grand narrative, where we're taking away from, again, that sort of more internal, closer, it's still a close narrative, but it's been elevated now to that kind of, monumental topic of life, like grief or addiction or motherhood or some like big thing. Yeah. Where it's sort of, it's nice to, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of turned a loop now in an odd way.
I haven't really thought about this much, because they're just so universal. They're so universal, these themes. Grief is big and small. Yeah.
Yeah. Quite right. Faiza, what do you think?
I think that, again, it should be enough that the thing is well written and is something that you want to say. And I'm very excited to read these books, and I've enjoyed a great number of them. But I don't think that something, again, we're back to authenticity, my pet peeve in life. I don't think that something should have to be like, look, this is true, I suffered through it, in order to be valid.
Yes. Or taken seriously.
And so, and so I feel that I'm kind of personally more inclined towards stories, again, such as Mira's collection, or, stories that take a small moment, an awkward thing. I mean, my favorite thing is awkwardness. It's like social awkwardness, somebody saying the wrong thing. I just love it. When you're like so embarrassed that you're like reading it and like sweating. So I just I love that.
Upon yourself, folding into oneself.
Exactly. I mean, not to write off the confessional genre, which I also absolutely love. And just today discovered that my favorite memoir that I've read in years by a British Pakistani or a British author of Pakistani origin, Arifa Akbar, is Consumed, is on the Bailey Gifford long list and is one of the most magnificent things I've read in ages. But I think also what's really interesting about it is that it is this different type of life, and it is not a white, privileged, middle class, I've had an unfortunate experience and here is my memoir. So that, but when you're white, you get to write that. And then when you're non-white, as I've said before, and as is my pet peeve in life, you just get to write about, what a shame it is that you're not white.
Absolutely. It's just a wonderful way to put it. But, and again, Mira, this might be a question that you get asked a lot. I'm still going to ask it because I'm personally always curious about this. Is that this kind of confessional work that Faiza has mentioned, and is wonderful, and I read it as well, and it's so powerful and it's so moving, but you also don't see it coming from brown women. And do you think that, and again in the same vein as fiction, at the very heart of it, as women writers of color and from a certain sort of background, and when I mean cultural milieu, is that it's just also very scary.
It is, and I it's very scary because, as my aunt once said, she said, I don't know if I can say this on the show, but if you write about sexual intimacy, for example, or you write about intimacy, your father's going to read it, your grandfather's going to read it. And so I think we are so conditioned into sort of anticipating our family's responses that we are scared, as you said. But Mina, I do think that in the younger generation, people, I see a lot of women pushing back. Social media has opened up this incredible avalanche of talent and of confessional, also sort of confessional style poetry and prose. And I see it, and I see younger brown women from different class backgrounds and from different milieux really pushing the envelope, not just in Pakistan, but in India as well.
Yes.
And so, fingers crossed that they continue doing that. And I think,
no, that's so exciting and really heartening, and that kind of visibility also. But there's so much more to talk about.
I do think social media, though, I think it's interesting because it's tricky, right? Social media was supposed to be a means to an end, but it's kind of become an end in itself now, right? Which is
a beast.
A beast, totally.
It's really become a beast.
But it's also enabled people to, I think what sells on social media is confession, and what sells is subjectivity. And just to take this back to what Faiza was saying earlier about her sort of queasiness with authenticity, I think that one can make a distinction between authenticity and subjectivity. And I think what is very powerful is one's intense subjectivity of an experience or of a moment or of a culture, right? Because we're living in an age where we are drenched with data. We open up our phone and our phone is screaming. It's an explosion of data. So what stands out then, right? It is your subjectivity. It is your very, very unique and distilled take on something that stands out. And I think that that's something that I really wanted to, that's why there's a colloquialism in the title, right? So that's something that I wanted to keep very close to me.
Well, you did, and well done. Congratulations on this wonderful book. Thank you so much, Mira and Faiza, for being with me today on the show. This wonderful, edifying, funny conversation. Are You Enjoying is out in, as they say, all good bookstores, which I feel like is a real nudge to bookstores that you better be a good bookstore to stock this book. Thank you guys for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to support local authors. Read the books. Read them intelligently and well. And when you give feedback, do it in a positive, in a sort of intelligent. Are You Enjoying is in bookstores all over Pakistan. All good bookstores all over Pakistan. Again, support your local talent. One day it'll be you on the shelf. Thank you guys for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on the coffee table. Enjoy.